It's great to have you here tonight. My name's Seth. I'm the pastor here, and we are in the middle of a series entitled Crossroads, where we're looking at some of the defining moments really in the ministry or around the ministry of Jesus, specifically throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And today I want to look at a story in Matthew, a storm story, if you will, which I love this story because even if you're maybe didn't grow up in church or kind of new to church, all of us have typically some basic familiarity with this story. The part where the disciples, they're in the middle of the Sea of Galilee and they're stuck there in a storm, and Jesus walks out to them on water. And so this is kind of where we're going to catch up with the story. Matthew chapter 14, starting at verse 22. It says, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd." The crowd that's referencing there is just before this. He had fed the 5,000 people. It was the miracle of taking the little boy's lunch with the loaf and the fish and multiplying it. It's a pretty amazing miracle. But he just dismissed that crowd. And said after he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And then verse 25, it goes on to say, "Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake." Now, interesting enough, Mark 2, actually Mark 6, I should say, shares a very similar account of what's going on there. But in Mark 6's account, there's a little detail there that's added on that I think is significant in terms of us understanding really the significance of the storm in this story, this particular storm story. We see it in Mark chapter 6, verse 48. He says, he was about to pass them by. That's referring to Jesus here, walking on water. It says he was about to pass them by when they saw him. He was about to pass them by when they saw him. When my wife and I were students at Eugene Bible College, I remember, I think I probably noticed her before she noticed me, and so I would sit in class and just daydream of man, if only I could get her to go out on a date with me, And so I was in love. I was pretty much smitten the moment I saw her, especially the first day she walked into class with the Dallas Cowboys sweatshirt. I was like, oh, she is the one. But the problem was, I was pretty sure, I noticed her, but she really didn't seem to notice me much. And so knowing that, she, at the time, we were students at this Bible college, and she also worked a job at this Christian bookstore just down the road. And so I knew what her car looked like, and so every time I would drive by the Christian bookstore and I saw her car in the parking lot, I would go in there and pretend like I was looking for books, And so I was in there probably a good 3-4 times a week. I was in there all the time. Every time I saw her car, I would go in there and just sort of pretend like I was accidentally just happened to be there. I didn't know you were going to be here too. And so I would go up there and typically I would try to ask for, her some direction on finding a book that made me sound a lot smarter than I really am. So I'm like, hey, you got any books on a post-colonial perspective of an Armenian view of sanctification? Get anything like that? And I'll be like, we got a Newsboys CD with that one. Oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what I need. Yeah, that's great. And again, I would kind of set this up, or I just pretend I'm sure she probably caught on pretty quickly, because again, it was almost every day, sometimes a couple times in the day, where I just happened to be in the bookstore, happened to bump into her, happened to show up when she was working. And again, my whole goal there was I was trying to get her to see me as more and notice me as more than simply just a friend. As just another classmate. I was hoping out of these accidental or not so accidental encounters that she would see me as more than just that. And I share that because in a way, that's kind of what's going on here in this story. Here's Jesus. It's almost kind of humorous when you look at it. It says he was about to pass them by. Here's Jesus just taking a stroll in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the storm, just walking on water, just doing his thing, right? And when it says the disciples, they saw him. right? This moment of notice, and you can just imagine Jesus like, oh, I wasn't expecting to run into you guys here too. Like, it was like this seemingly chance encounter, this accidental encounter that wasn't accidental, it was actually very intentional. And it was intentional because it really, and I say that because it really speaks to the significance of the story and the significance of this whole story when we speak of defining moments around the ministry of Jesus. Because, again, he was trying to get them to notice him and to see him for who he really was and who he really is in our lives, which, as we talked about last week, is so much more than I think sometimes we kind of want to box God in, or a box of expectations or presumption. See, for the disciples, at this point, all the way up to this storm, like, they saw Jesus as a good guy, they saw Jesus as a friend, they saw Jesus as a rabbi, they saw him as a good teacher, they even saw him as a Messiah, potentially a Messiah who's going to come and deliver the people, right? But this story, why it's so significant, is because at the end of this story, the end of this storm, this would be the first time the disciples would actually see him for who he really is, which is Lord. Lord and Savior of our lives. In fact, at the very end of the storm story, that's actually what we see in verse 33. It says, "Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" It was this moment of realization that he's a friend, he's a teacher, he's a Messiah, but he's even so much more than that. He is the Son of God. You know, God in a body, if you will, God in the flesh, right? And so it was a significant moment, certainly in the lives of the disciples, and in terms of how they saw Jesus. But even more than that, they also didn't just get greater clarity in terms of who Jesus was, but they also got greater clarity in relation to who they were as well, and specifically God's calling in their life. God's calling in their life. Now, oftentimes when we hear this concept of a calling, we can tend to think of it in very mystical terms, right? We tend to think of it oftentimes almost like this booming voice from heaven, big glow, doves flying around, or we think of it and we put it in a box when we hear God's calling. We tend to box it in simply in terms of like a vocational ministry, like going, I'm going to become a pastor for my job, for my life, or being a missionary in the fields of Africa somewhere. But the truth is, when it comes to God's calling in your life, God's calling to ministry, we're all called to ministry.
Amen.
Every single one of us has a calling on our life. It's just that calling sometimes takes very different forms. Some of you, that calling to ministry is a call to, launch a business, to be a witness in the marketplace. For some of you, that calling might be to be a teacher and to be an influencer in our education system. And so that calling can take on different forms. But what's interesting about this, and what I love about the story, as we're going to come to discover, is that a calling of God is always going to lead you through a storm.
Amen.
And let me kind of put this in a little perspective. This past week, we went to listen to this presidential forum for Foursquare. Foursquare, about every 8 years, they elect a new president of the denomination. So we went there, and it's down to like these two candidates, both amazing candidates, they had great responses to questions. I was just super impressed with what they had to share and what they had to say. But one of the candidates, so in particular, they were talking about kind of God's calling in relation to the next generation. And the importance of us being intentional about really empowering and lifting up the next generation, really encouraging them to take that step, that calling into, as it relates to vocational ministry. That calling, we need more pastors, we need more missionaries. And I loved it. I was like, man, right on. I'm nodding, I'm amening. And I loved her whole point. I loved her heart behind it. Where I get a little bit of, had a little bit of a qualm with, I guess, if you will. There was her illustration to emphasize the point. Because she went on to kind of share this story of a student that she knew that went to a Foursquare Bible College, and when she was there, she, after one of her classes, went up to one of the professors. And so she goes up to the professor and she starts sharing. She's like, I know God has called me, I believe, to step into vocational full-time ministry, to be a pastor. And this professor, he starts to just tell her all the reasons why he feels like she should not be a pastor. You know, all the reasons why she shouldn't be, why she couldn't be, why she can't. And look, here's where my kind of qualm with it and this is that certainly the professor's approach to it was wrong. You know, he should have, definitely, we would like to lean on the side of encouraging, young leaders to step into that. So his approach was wrong. But can I tell you, actually, his response was actually right. Here's what I mean by that. Is that the truth was, she actually wasn't called to ministry. Because as she went on to kind of share the story of this student, was that student went on from there to just kind of pursue a whole other career field. And here's why I say that, why she wasn't called, is because, listen, if you're called to something, how do you know the difference between calling and simply just wanting to do something? Is when you're called to something, I don't care what somebody says, I don't care, all the reasons they give you why you can't do something, why you can't step out in faith, why you can't respond to God's call. I don't care even if they're an so-called expert in Bible college. If you know that God has called you to something, God has called you to a ministry, God has called you to be a missionary, God has called you to be a teacher, God has called you to step out in faith and start that business. If you're called, there's nothing in this world that can stop you from stepping out in that. Yeah. See, and this kind of starts to get to the significance of the storm. Why would God lead them through a storm? It is because, listen, you can't walk in God's calling for your life, whatever God's calling in your life is, without going through storms. Amen. Because it's those storms that reveal the difference between simply a calling and a want to. And that's exactly what we see. And it actually helps to give us a little perspective on kind of what's going on here in Jesus' kind of a request to the disciples, or kind of push in the disciples' life. We see this in Matthew 14, verses 22 and 24. It says, get this, it says, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat, and the wind was against it. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat, and the wind was against it. Now notice who orchestrates this. It says that Jesus chooses a boat, he puts them in the boat, he makes them take the boat, he tells them to go on the other side. Notice again, in relation to this call, we're going to get a little bit better picture of God's calling on their life in just a moment, kind of this new season he was calling them into, as in terms of ministry for their lives. But notice he calls them again to go through a story. This is a challenge for a lot of us because oftentimes when we think of the path of God, or God's will in our life, or God's call in our life, we think of it in terms of the path of least resistance. If God is calling me somewhere, it's like, God, all I got to do is just look for the open door, the easy door. But what makes this passage so challenging is that that's not what we see. We see Jesus actually leading them. It's not like he didn't know there was a storm. It's not like he's like, oh man, my app must be wrong. Sorry guys, I didn't mean to send you out into that storm. I mean, it was, he knew that they were he was sending them into a storm. He was sending them into a challenge. And I share this because something you got to get, if you're going to step into God's call in your life, you'll walk in God's will for your life, walk to God's dream or destiny he's placed in your life. Listen, you need to understand that just because something in your life is opposed does not mean it's not ordained. Just because something in your life is opposed does not mean it's not ordained. So often, again, we think the way and the will of God is the path of least resistance. I'm always going to have the wind at my back. It's going to be smooth sailing. It's like cruising on a yacht or something. But the reality is there's going to be some storms. And this is important because some of you, and maybe you've recently taken a step of faith. You've taken a step towards answering God's call to step into a relationship with Him. And the moment you took that step, all of a sudden you're wondering, man, why does it feel like there's so much stuff? I feel like my family's under attack. I feel like my job's under attack. I feel like there's just so much coming against me. Or maybe God, again, called you, He's placed a dream in your heart and calling you to take some action on that. And the moment you started to take a step towards it, it just felt like, man, everyone was coming against you. telling you all the reasons it would never work, all the reasons it couldn't work, all the reasons it can't work. And listen, I share this because if we really believe there's an enemy of our soul, which we do, if there's an enemy who is out to steal, kill, and destroy, who wants nothing but the worst for you, wouldn't it make sense that as God is trying to lead and bring about the best in you, that the enemy would quickly come against you with the very worst he has to throw against you? And again, I share that to encourage you that especially when you're in those moments where you kind of those crossroads moments of stepping in and walking out God's will, God's call in your life, is listen, never discern God's will for you, again, by what is simply easy for you. Never discern God's will for you by what's easy for you, because the truth is, what's easy for you is not always God's best for you. What's easiest for you is not always what's best for you. Like, what's easy for you is to not work out. Like, it's easy for me to not work out, right? That's easy. Is it the best for me? No. Right? Like what's easy for us is to just spend and never set a budget when it comes to our finances. Is it the best for our finances? No. What's easy for us is to live a life stuck in status quo. What's easy is to live a life stuck in bitterness, but it's not always what's best for us. Because again, what's easy for you rarely ever leads to what's best for you. Which brings us again to this calling into a new season for the disciples here. So you see, there was a best kind of life that he was trying to kind of bring out of these disciples and kind of lead them into, but it was going to take them going through some storms, going through some challenges to bring that about. Not easy, but what was ultimately would be the best for them. And so to do that, it would lead them through a storm, which, by the way, I think it's important to know is that I found that significant storms always signal new seasons. Significant storms in our life, when we find ourselves stepping into a storm, they always signal new seasons in our life. We see this in the natural, the end of the beginning of a season change in nature. That's when the storms are at their worst. But we also see it in the supernatural as well, when you're taking those steps to walk in and walk out God's will and God's call on your life. And this is what we see, and we get a glimpse of this in verse 22. It says, again, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. But here again is that glimpse into kind of this new season that he was kind of calling them into. And we see it in this simple phrase. It says, he made the disciples get into the boat, and it says, and go ahead of him to the other side. Go ahead of him to the other side. Now, this is significant. And again, this is why I say this is such a crossroads story, a significant story, not just in the life of Jesus, but in the life of these disciples. Because, just put this a little bit in context, at the very beginning of chapter 14 in Matthew is right at the very end of John the Baptist's ministry. John the Baptist, at the very beginning of this chapter, he is beheaded, he's falsely accused, falsely tried, and ultimately falsely executed. But again, if you remember anything about John the Baptist, what was his main ministry? What was his purpose on this earth? It was ultimately to prepare the way for the Messiah, to prepare the way for Jesus. And so now, fast forward again to this latter part of the chapter, in this section where it says that Jesus made them go in front of him. Now, up to this point, they had never done that. Up to this point, this is the first reference of Jesus ever taking a step back to usher them towards the front. Because all the way up to this point, like their experience when it came to walking in faith was just that. It was learning to walk in faith. It was doing everything Jesus did. Walking, everywhere Jesus went, they walked. Everywhere Jesus stepped, they stepped. Everything Jesus did, they did. They were learning what it was to walk in faith. But here we begin to see this shift. But hey, I don't want you just to learn what it is to walk in faith. Now I want you to actually just take some steps to walk out that faith. And so he takes this step back. And it's almost like this passing of the baton. John the Baptist ministry, preparing the way. I'm now handing it off to you. Again, see this new season that he's ushering them in relation to God's ministry, God's call in their life. But even more than that, here's what I really love about this is as we're going to discover in the story, Jesus takes a step back. But what we're going to also discover in this process is He steps back just far enough to where he's out of their sight, but never out of his.
Yeah.
He steps back just far enough, and we're going to see this in the story, just far enough to where he's out of their sight, but never out of his. And listen, this is so vital for, I think, many of us tonight. Because if you're honest, there's some of you, let's be honest, you're going through a storm right now.
Mhm.
Oh, like a storm. This is more than some story from 2,000 years ago. Like this is your life right now. You're going through a financial storm. Maybe you're going through a relational storm. Maybe you're going through a health storm. Maybe you're even going through a spiritual storm where you're just struggling to believe that God is here, let alone that God could be for you, have a plan for you, have anything good, because you're struggling to see him in the midst of the waves, in the midst of the wind, in the midst of the struggle. But again, it's so important that we get that while Jesus may be out of your sight, you're never out of his.